Have you ever heard of a man named JFK? Have you ever heard people say key phrases like Elm Street, Grassy Knoll, or Texas School Book Depository? Most people know Kennedy and these phrases because of his assassination. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was the 35th President of the United States. He went from 1961 to 1963. If you have a sharp eye, you'll notice 1 year is cut off from his presidential term. This was due to his assassination while on a presidential campaign trip in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd of 1963. Now, I could sit here and talk all day about JFK and what I love about him as a president, but today we're going to be focusing on his assassination as it spawned conspiracies and an effect on the United States. You might be asking, what are the most important parts of his assassination? I'd like to call it DBCE, or Details, Backstory, Conspiracies, and Effects. Now, I can't just simply answer that question. It's far too difficult. Why don't we elaborate? 12:29 p.m. The day is nice, and it is very sunny outside. The president continues down Main Street in his presidential motorcade, waving at the bystanders. The original route was planned for the presidential car to go straight down Main Street, but it was changed last second for the president to turn right onto Houston Street. The car then turns left down Elm Street. Nellie Connolly turns around to the president. She remarks, "Mr. President, you sure can't say Dallas doesn't love you now." John's last words are, "No, you certainly can't." At this time, Abraham Zapruder gets his home movie camera out and starts filming. According to the Warren Commission, about a third of the way down Elm Street, Lee Harvey Oswald fires a shot from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository that hits the president in the back, which then exits his Adam's apple, which also passes through Texas Governor John Connally, entering above his armpit, passing through and breaking his wrist and lodging in his knee. A second shot completely misses both, and the third and final shot hits Kennedy in his right temple, creating a massive wound and killing him instantly. Jackie Kennedy starts climbing over the back of the car, as a Secret Service agent by the name of Clint Hill stops Jackie from climbing out. Many people think that Jackie was trying to escape the car, but she was actually picking up a piece of John's brain that flew onto the back of the car. The car races to Parkland Hospital. The United States at this time is in shock, and most of the stock markets close. Many news stations deliver iconic messages. Once again, according to the Warren Commission, 45 minutes after Kennedy's shooting, Lee Harvey Oswald guns down police officer J.D. Tippit. At about 1:40 p.m., Oswald is captured and arrested inside the Texas Theater after having snuck in without paying. Oswald is taken for questioning. Parallel to these events, at about 1 p.m., the president is officially pronounced dead by a Catholic priest. The body is taken to Love Field Airport and onto the plane he previously rode into Dallas on, Air Force One. This is also where Lyndon Baines Johnson takes the oath of office to become the 36th President of the United States. On November 24th, Lee Harvey Oswald is assassinated himself by nightclub owner Jack Ruby while being transported to a nearby county jail. Oswald, Tippit, and Kennedy are all laid to rest on the day of November 25th. Oswald is buried in Fort Worth, Tippit is buried in Dallas, and Kennedy is buried in Arlington. Kennedy's funeral was actually modeled after Lincoln's, as Lincoln was assassinated 100 years before. In terms of backstory, there's different things we could talk about. We can talk about the backstory of Oswald, the backstory of Kennedy as a president, or just the president's day in Dallas. Actually, why don't we just do all three? Let's start with the story of Kennedy as a president. But first you might be asking, why is he talking about this when he said he'd only talk about his assassination? Let me backtrack and rephrase. Let's start with the story of Kennedy's presidency and why it might have had an effect on his assassination, or at least the potential planning of it. Two major things that could have initiated his assassination are the Bay of Pigs incident and his speech on secret societies in 1961. In his speech that potentially got him killed, he explained that there were secret societies that were operating. He also explained that these secret societies were creating plots. He didn't name any names, but many people think that this speech initiated one certain secret society to get scared of their plots being revealed. This society is believed to be the CIA, or Central Intelligence Agency, whose deputy director at the time was George H.W. Bush, senior of George W. Bush. I myself believe the CIA did have something to do with the death of Kennedy, but that's a story for another time. Another incident in Kennedy's presidency that could have led to people wanting to kill him was the Bay of Pigs incident. Before Kennedy's inauguration in 1961, the CIA briefed Kennedy on a plan to invade the Bay of Pigs and ultimately overthrow Fidel Castro using Cuban people and military. Not only did bombings fail, but Cuba sent a counterattack including 20,000 troops and control of the skies. The botched invasion led to 1,200 exiles surrendered and 100 dead. This left an impact on Kennedy's administration, leaving many people to dislike him. Now let's talk about Oswald's backstory, and the surprising amount of evidence pushing that he did kill Kennedy, or at least had a motive. Oswald was a Marxist. More importantly, he saw a good form of socialism in Castro's revolution. Ironically, Oswald planned another assassination before Kennedy's. He planned to kill Dallasite General Walker, most likely for being a critic of Castro. The plan failed because his bullet was deflected by a window frame. In terms of JFK's assassination, on Thursday, November 21st, Oswald got a ride from his co-worker Wesley Frazier to where Oswald's wife was staying. Apparently, Oswald got his Mannlicher Carcano rifle from the garage. The next morning of November 22nd, Oswald and Frazier left for the depository building, leaving Oswald's entire $170 savings and wedding ring behind. Oswald reportedly put his rifle in a wrapped package in the back seat of Frazier's car. Frazier didn't suspect much of Oswald, but when Frazier did ask what was inside, Oswald said it was curtain rods. Oswald took the package to the 6th floor of the depository. Oswald was able to have a moment of privacy to set up a sniper's nest with boxes. Kennedy's last days in Texas included speeches and visits to certain places in San Antonio, Houston, Fort Worth, and Dallas. It's very interesting to see how the feeling and presence in Texas can change so severely and rapidly. November 21st. In San Antonio, the party headed to Brooks Air Force Base. Then on to Houston, where he addressed a Latin American citizens organization and spoke at a testimonial dinner for Congressman Albert Thomas. The day of November 21st ended in Fort Worth. November 22nd. The presence that rainy morning in Fort Worth was very pleasant, as Kennedy gave a speech outside the hotel him and his wife Jackie stayed in. The party then flew from Carswell Air Force Base to Love Field. After leaving the plane, Jackie and John spent several minutes shaking hands. Jackie received her iconic red roses. The party then went on to their dedicated cars. John and Nellie Connolly were already seated in the motorcade as John and Jackie were seated. The chain of cars wound through downtown Dallas as to get to the Dallas Trade Mart, where Kennedy was scheduled to give a speech. The president continues down Main Street in his presidential motorcade, waving at the bystanders. And the rest is history. A strangely important effect Kennedy's assassination had was the outbreak of conspiracies. Instantly, people wanted to see if the Warren Commission was telling the truth. Because of this, many different conspiracy theories have spawned. As I said before, the first bullet that hit anyone passed through JFK, hitting John Connally. But is that really what happened? This claim has deemed the name single bullet theory. Other people have called it the magic bullet theory. But to me, the latter is very illogical. They call it the magic bullet because they say that it would have had to go through JFK, make a very sharp turn, and then go through Connally, making another turn, going through his wrist and knee. But you really have to consider the positioning of the people and how the car was made. The car was a presidential limo, so it had to be designed that way. The car was made so that the presidential seats were lifted higher than the front seats. It was also made so that the two seats where the Connollys were sitting were moved inward farther. Another thing to consider is that we really don't know who did the shooting, or more importantly, where they did it from. But it is believed that the single bullet actually came from the 2nd or 3rd floor of the Dal-Tex building, which was across the street from the depository. As you can see from this picture, it would make even more sense if the shooter was in the Dal-Tex building. It correlates with all the factors of the car. If you really think about it, don't you think that a shot from the depository would be way too steep of a shot? The so-called grassy knoll is known for being this area here. Behind this picket fence is where many people think a second shooter was who delivered the fatal shot. Now, why do people believe this? It's because, 1, JFK goes back into the left when he gets shot. If he's shot from behind like people believe, how could he go back into the left? Wouldn't he go forwards into the left? It is possible for a jet effect to happen, causing an object to go the opposite direction of where it was shot from, but really, what are the chances? The position of this believed shooter was forward and to the right, which makes perfect sense for Kennedy to go back into the left. 2, do you really believe Oswald could do it alone? It's been proven that the 2 later shots that were fired in rapid succession can really be accomplished, but it took a professional sharpshooter to do it. I don't think Oswald had the same temperament killing a president in front of many bystanders as a professional's temperament shooting a target dummy, so it's logical for there to be a second shooter to pull off one of those shots fired in rapid succession. Whether it was a coincidence or not, there were many suspicious people in Dealey Plaza that day. Was it people hired and planted in those spots for specific reasons? Or was it purely chance for people to act strangely? Look at this picture. Doesn't seem unusual, right? Besides Kennedy being shot, of course. Now let's look at a different picture. Now let's zoom in on this picture here. Can you see it? Now here is the artist's rendering of it. As you can see, there are multiple men standing behind this picket fence. One man appears to be wearing glasses with a police uniform and a badge shooting a rifle. And strangely, there's two other men beside him. The thing about this picture is that it makes sense. You can see the rifle's muzzle flash, which means he had just shot the rifle. And if you look at Kennedy, you can see that he's in a state of moving back into the left. And I think you can also see a cloud of blood above his head along with pieces of brain matter. Look at this picture. Do you see anything? Let me zoom in on what's important. This one's very astonishing. You could say that it's just a regular person walking away, but just look at his stance and how he's seemingly putting his hands in his pockets. Doesn't that seem very suspicious? This is the Umbrella Man. You might be thinking this man is not suspicious, but why does this man have an umbrella in the middle of broad daylight? You could say it's because earlier that morning it was raining, but he had plenty of, almost too much time to put that umbrella away. And even more suspicious, why does he put it up right after or before JFK is shot? Many people think that he was signaling shooters that they could shoot, hence why his umbrella is up right when JFK gets shot in the throat. Whether you like it or not, JFK's presidency and assassination really did affect the world, and in many ways you might not imagine. Like, look at the way it affected civil rights. If JFK had lived, the debate on the Civil Rights Act would have lasted much longer and might not have even succeeded. But after his assassination, Johnson took it upon himself to pass the Civil Rights Act in 1964 to honor Kennedy's legacy. The Voting Rights Act was also passed in 1965. The same desire to keep pushing Kennedy's legacy happened with the space program. As he said, "This nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before the decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth." And inevitably, in 1969, a year before the decade went out, Apollo 11 astronauts Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon and were returned safely to the Earth. Of course, there are negative ways his death affected the U.S. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, respected Kennedy as a man and thought of him as a man he could trust. After his death, Khrushchev returned to being aggressive against America. It lasted 20 years until Ronald Reagan asked for the Berlin Wall to come down. Vietnam was affected as well. Kennedy did not want to send any more troops to Vietnam. 2 years after his death, Lyndon Johnson approved the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which let him send mass amounts of troops to Vietnam. So in the long run, Kennedy's assassination spawned Soviet distrust for 20 years and a war in Vietnam for 10. And of course, America was affected in smaller ways. It spawned the longest uninterrupted TV news event in TV history until 9/11. Before that, newspapers were the main source of news. But to me, the two most important effects it had were spawning the conspiracies era and spawning a permanent distrust in the federal government. I like to think that the quote-unquote hippie era started as people distrusting the government. As well, I like to think that his assassination is still having a lasting effect on the U.S. We can see now that many people distrust politicians and our government, and many people take conspiracies more seriously. So in conclusion, why did I make this video other than for school? My goal is to inform and spark conversations. I want other people to know this, as it's some of the most important stuff in American history to me. I want people to understand not only what happened, but how the world has changed since then. It might seem strange for me to say that everything I talked about in this video I'm passionate about. I didn't just follow orders under my teacher. I've had an interest in this stuff for months. It might not seem like much, but it seems like years to me. Learning about Kennedy and his assassination has ultimately sparked my interest in history, and I can gladly say it's positively affected me. I hope this video possibly sparked an interest for you. Or I hope this video gave you some information you can say you're glad to have learned. And possibly, I hope you can now converse with your friends, family, and/or teachers on not just what you learned, but what your opinions are about it.